Why would we want to change our teaching methods? What we do as teachers has worked for decades, even centuries. What's changed? What's changed is perhaps our students more than anything else. And in many cases, what's changed is our own circumstances. We live in an age in which our students are in motion, both physically and electronically. And unless we are able to adjust to that fact, unless we are able to adjust to the fact that we too are in motion electronically and may continue to be to a greater extent in the future, we may not be as effective as teachers as we want to be. So today, I would like to discuss some approaches to handling that problem. And one of the excellent approaches that came out of California a few years ago is something called sheltered instructional observational protocol. I know it's a mouthful, but it basically says, let's apply some science to teaching. Let's recognize that this experiment that we are doing as teachers has been modified, that we're not always dealing with the same students that we were dealing with 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, that in fact our student bodies may be changing by semester, and that unless we adjust to that, we're not going to be effective. It doesn't mean that there's any one way to teach students. You, only you, as the instructor, can make the final decision as to what strategy, what approach you want to use in your classroom. Students in motion? Yes. Physical and electronic migration is more the order of the day than the exception. And if it's not the order where you are now, it will be in your career. There are approaches that can help. One of those is called SEOP. That is Sheltered Instruction Operational Protocol. It all sounds very scientific, and that's because it is. But the bottom line is we need to teach the students in front of us. This is what a colleague of mine had to say. Why would I care about SEOP? I don't see a need to shelter my students. I certainly don't want to follow observational protocols. Sheltered instructional observation protocols aren't for my classes. Or are they? We would all like to think that we are Socrates, or at least one of his humble students. But the truth is, we're more of a modern sage on the stage. We can conduct a pretty dynamic class. We have some pretty good ideas. And until recently, in most of our classes, they worked rather well. But some changes have been occurring in many classrooms. Initially, this started back in the 80s in the US, but it is a change in the classrooms that has spread around the world. I know this because I've taught in many places around the world. And the composition of classrooms, gender and race and religion is not monolithic in almost any case. In most cases, we have very diverse classes, students with very different backgrounds. And this is what the SEOP approach is designed to help us cope with. We live in an age of great and constant migration. Much of that is physical, people moving from one country to another, and from that country to another, and sometimes back again. There is a fairly high percentage of 8 billion people at any given time who are in motion. This is not a new situation. The history of mankind is the history of migration. But the complexity and the speed of modern migration has made the process of teaching and integrating students into societies more challenging than it was in the past. The level of migration is astounding. The United States, in terms of numbers, probably has the greatest number, but most developed countries around the world are experiencing high degrees of migration. And in some cases, the changes to the local population, percentage-wise, are much greater than the changes in countries like the United States and Germany. There's another kind of migration that's going on, and that's the migration of the mind through electronics. Over 5 billion of our 8 billion citizens of planet Earth um, are online. They're hooked up to internets. 92% of them are walking around with some type of communicating telephone. 63% of the population are internet users. This is a major change in how people interrelate. And for us as teachers, it's a gigantic change because it changes both who can come to your classroom, but also which classrooms you can go to. Also at play is trade and remittance. Global trade has increased. Manufacturing is done in places where it was not done before. Trading is done in different places than it was done before. And remittance is a major feature in the economies of many smaller countries because remittance is the money that people migrate to more developed countries to obtain, and then they send it back home. This has all contributed to a change in our educational culture. There's basically two key ways of looking at educational culture and how what the best methods will be for operating in those cultures. In many countries in the past, and until perhaps 50 years ago in virtually all countries, we could say that our student population was homogeneous, that they shared beliefs, that they shared background, that when the instructor stood in front of the students, they had a shared culture that made many aspects of teaching a little less difficult. Not that it's ever a non-challenge. Teaching is always a challenge if we to get the results that we want. But in a homogeneous society, there are a few less barriers to success. What we see in many countries now, not just the United States, in many countries is a heterogeneous society, a heterogeneous student population. If you'll look at the sign below, you'll see it's very difficult to read the sign because all the letters are different. And I did that on purpose because in a classroom in which all the students are different, it can be very exciting. It can be very interesting, but it can also be very difficult for you and the students to be as successful as you want to be unless you look the problem straight in the eye and use scientific approaches to deal with it. In the old comfortable world that most of us lived in until relatively recently as teachers, we taught these homogeneous societies. What's a homogeneous society look like? Everyone speaks the same language. Okay, 99.9%. There's always some exceptions. Most people are of the same race. Most people are of the same nationality, citizenship, religion, politics, education, experience. Even folklore and customs are shared across the board. There are many countries that are still very much like this in the world, but just a few years ago, say 2 generations ago, most countries were like this. Now, most countries are closer to the heterogeneous model in which many students are speaking different languages. Many students are from different countries originally, speak different languages, have different races, have different religions, have different political views, have been educated under entirely different systems up to the point that they come into your classroom. They've had experiences that are quite different than those of that you had growing up, that the students that you previously had growing up. The folklore that they grew up on is different. The customs that they are accustomed to is different. Each one of these things adds a compounding barrier that makes it more difficult to be successful with a one-size-all fits all type of instruction. So, sheltered instructional observation protocol is a modern new approach, and we are going to go into some detail in analyzing it, and I believe that you will find that there are tools here, maybe not all of them all the time, but many of them often that will be useful.